Thank you. Can you all hear me fantastically? Fantastic. I love that. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good? Good? All right, great. So, as mentioned, I'm Ryan. I'm Senior Engineer at HumanMade, and I'm here to introduce you all to the REST API and hopefully give you an idea of how to actually use this thing. For any of you who feel awkward not looking at me, that's fine. I understand. Stare at the slides instead. They're more important. So, let's get started. First up, what API are we actually talking about here? Also, if you hear any feedback, please let me know, because I hate that, and I can move away from the mic or whatever. So, let's get started talking about this API. What API am I talking about? So this talk is about the WordPress REST API that's intended for core. Who here has heard of the REST API? Great. Who here knows what the REST API is? Okay, less hands. Good. So WordPress has a lot of APIs already built into it. These are things like the HTTP API that you might use to access external services, or the plugins API, things like actions and filters. Those are all types of APIs in core. The REST API is an external API. It's an API that reveals data to things outside of WordPress. So that can be things like mobile clients or other sites accessing the data or things like that. So WordPress actually already has an external API. It's called the XML RPC API. So XML RPC is a pretty widely used standard that's used to access data in all sorts of blogging software. It was invented in about 1997 by Dave Weiner, who also invented RSS. It's used by the mobile clients. So if you have the WordPress app on your phone or something like that, it's used by that. Unfortunately, XML RPC is pretty terrible. For anybody who's worked with XML, you might understand just the joys of working with XML. And XML-C is worse again on top of that. In fact, 40% of the code in the iOS client is just to pass XML so that they can do this. So 40% is just wasted code, essentially. So in the past decade, we've seen the rise of REST APIs instead. And these offer a bit of an alternative to previous APIs, things like XML RPC or SOAP or anything like that. So Steve from Braintree talked about this a bit yesterday. And today we're going to be talking about how this works with WordPress. You might have actually already used a REST API without realizing it was a REST API. There's some great examples out there, including Stripe. Is that feeding back, by the way? Okay, great. So Stripe is a payment processor, and basically their entire business is built around their REST API. It's a much easier way for developers to take payments and interact with monetary systems. Twitter also has a REST API. And so Twitter's REST API is a big part of why they're popular. It allows third-party clients to connect to Twitter and get data out of there. And it allows for integrations into different sites. If you have a Twitter widget on your site, it uses the REST API. Github also has a fantastic REST API. It allows third-party integrations. And this is how things like Travis for automated building and anything that involves taking data out of GitHub or putting stuff in there works. So these APIs are a lot easier to use than the older XML-based APIs. And they're a key part of why a lot of these sites are actually really popular. So today I'm talking about the WordPress REST API. So the WordPress REST API, as the name says, is a REST API for WordPress. It's built as a plugin, but it's designed to be used as part of core. Our plan is to get it integrated into core, hopefully sometime this year. We'll see about that. It's been in development for about 2 years so far, and it's a reasonably popular community-driven project. So there's myself, again, senior engineer at HumanMade, and Rachel Baker, previously a senior engineer at 10up, now the lead engineer at the Wirecutter. We're the lead developers of the project, and so we take care of things like releasing and the general direction of the project. There's also 2 contributing developers on top of that to version 2.0. Daniel Buckhuber, I believe lead of engineering at Fusion, a media company, and Joe Hoyle, the CTO of Human Made, also my boss. At last count, we had 53 total contributors, but that's always growing. Last time I gave this presentation, not this presentation, but a presentation, it was at 48 or something like that. And that wasn't too long ago. So we're constantly growing that. So recently we released version 2 of the REST API. Version 2 is basically taking everything that we learned from version 1 and applying it and breaking things in the process. We're trying to learn from the mistakes that we made the first time and fix them this time while we still have time to do that. As part of doing that, we're breaking backwards compatibility, which sucks for a lot of people, but version 1 will always be around and it's always going to be compatible. So we've guaranteed that. A lot of version 2 is about taking the internals of the API out and redoing them from scratch. So the external API hasn't actually changed much from what we started with, but the internals have been almost completely redone. So now that we've established what API we're talking about, let's get into how do we use it. So, although we want this plugin to be part of WordPress core, and it is on track to be there, you can actually go and use it today. You can go and install the plugin that we have. Version 1 is available through the plugins repository. And in fact, it's built into your dashboard. It's on a special page called beta testing, which will be up in the top navigation. And that's because this is a feature plugin designed for WordPress core. The plan is to get it into core, and so we're trying to promote as many people using it as we can at the moment. Version 2 that we've been working on recently is available on GitHub, and so you can go and grab it from there, just as a zip or bring it down with Git. So what is this REST? I've talked a little bit about what REST clients are, but to be able to use the REST API, you actually need to know what REST is. So REST is actually really easy. In fact, most of you have probably done a little bit like it before. So REST forms the basis for what our API is. And it's built around 4 key methods. And you've seen a few of these at least before. It's built around get, post, put, and delete. So every resource takes one of these. So get obviously gets the resource, post creates the resource, put updates, and delete deletes. It's pretty simple. So these all operate on resources. What's a resource? A resource is a noun. So that's things like posts, comments, terms, users, custom post types, revisions, things like that. For example, for single posts, we can go and use 3 of these. We can get a single post data, we can update that post data, or we can delete that post. Deleting is actually trashing under the hood because WordPress supports trashing for posts. You'll notice that post itself isn't here though, and that's because we can't create a post that already exists. We can't pick a new ID when we create a post. Instead, what we do is we create that post as part of the collection that it belongs to. So you'll see here that we are looking at just /posts. So this is the list of the latest posts. We can go and grab that list, or we can add a new item into it, which is creating a new post. And this concept of collections is one thing that's kind of integral to the API. It's basically a list of other resources. So anytime you want to create something, what you're actually doing is you're adding into that list. So we support both single endpoints and collections for all sorts of data that's in WordPress. We support basically every form of data that's in WordPress that's a major piece of data. You'll notice that we don't support options. We don't support plugins or themes in here. Those are coming down the line. They just haven't been done yet. Everything you can see on the screen here supports both reading and writing. So you can go and create new posts. You can upload images. You can create new meta or update meta. You can look at revisions, restore, things like that. All of these are read and write. So the REST API also includes a discovery method. And the discovery method basically is so that you can look at a site and see, is the API available? And if so, how do I actually access it? This is very similar to RSS or Atom feed discovery if you've ever used that. Basically, the way that we do that is that we send a head request to the site. So head requests are just the same as GET requests. It's basically as if you're viewing a page in your browser. The difference between head and GET is that with head, we don't get back any of the data in the body. So we don't get any HTML. We just get the headers that are being sent back. And so that reduces the amount of data that we have to look through and receive quite a lot. So if you send a head request off, you'll see in the headers there's this link. And the link actually tells you where to go and find the API. You'll see that this one has a relation, or rel, of github.com/blah, blah, blah. And so that is just telling us that this link is of the type REST API. So you look through the headers, you find one of these, and then you follow that to go in and find the API. This works on any site that has the API, and the idea is that rather than hard-coding URLs, you can instead take any user-supplied URL, send a head request, and get this back to find where it is. And that works well with things like custom subdirectories or multiple sites on a domain. The stuff that you see here is actually also real data. You can go and run this on wired.com, and you'll see that they're actually running the REST API. So apart from discovery, we also have authentication. Obviously, to access any data in WordPress that's privileged, you need to be able to log in, and that's what this authentication is. There are two main ways to use authentication with the REST API, depending on where you're trying to access this data from. The first of these is cookie authentication. So cookie authentication is great for things like plugins or themes that are running within the context of WordPress itself. So cookie authentication is just the normal standard WordPress login. Your user goes to the WordPress login screen, they log in, and now they have their cookies. The only difference is that you need to also send a nonce with that request. And so the nonce is a cross-site request forgery token. Basically, it means that people can't try and add iframes into their sites to run things on the API without you actually going and doing that yourself. This is actually really easy to go and add, and we have a JavaScript SDK that will go and do all of this for you. You can just use some JavaScript functions, and it will work it all out for you. For external clients, those running outside of WordPress, those can go and use OAuth instead. And so OAuth will be familiar to quite a lot of you. If you've ever used Twitter or Facebook and linked your account to that, you've used OAuth. And so those screens that say link your account, whatever, behind the hood, those are doing OAuth process. So the difference between OAuth and regular ways of communicating over an API is that rather than using username and password directly, you instead get an access token. And with every request, you send that access token along. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. There's a spec called OAuth 2, which obviously is the next version of OAuth. But unfortunately, that actually requires SSL, so we can't use it on something designed for WordPress core because we can't make SSL a requirement for WordPress. Instead, you have to use OAuth 1, which is a little bit more complicated and involves you having to create signatures and those sorts of things under the hood. This form of authentication is not actually built into the plugin proper. Instead, it's a separate plugin while we work on it and try and iterate through it a bit more quickly. The eventual plan is to get that into WordPress core, the same as all the other pieces of code that we have. So if you want to know how to use the API, I'd also suggest that you go and try it out right now. The API is actually self-documenting. It'll tell you what it expects and what it's going to give back. You can go through and browse this in your browser or in a REST API client software, and you can click through and see all the data that's available. You don't have to install it on your own site either. There's a few sites out there that are already running this today. So for example, the Brisbane WordCamp site, the site for this WordCamp itself is running it. Wired is running it, and Post Status is also running it. If you'd like to check what higher traffic websites look like with much more data. So with that said, how do we take this REST API and extend it, right? So you're running the REST API locally. You have a client that wants to be able to build a mobile app or something like that. How do you go and give your own data through the API? So the API is actually fully extensible just like normal WordPress core. And just like WordPress core, please don't hack the plugin. Okay, we have a very good plugin API, and that's for a reason. Occasionally we need to roll out updates to the plugin. That's for things like security updates or something like that. And those will go over auto updates quite a lot of the time if they're very severe. And we've had a few of those happen already. If you go and edit the plugin to go and add your stuff in there, then you'll end up losing all of that data, and your mobile apps will start crashing and things like that when the site auto updates. Or even worse than that, your plugin might not auto update, and so your site will be vulnerable instead. So with that said, let's jump into an example. So this function here is just a regular PHP function that I whipped up. It takes an ID in an array, and it returns the post title of the latest post by that author. If WordPress can't find that author, or if they haven't published any posts, then it will instead return null. So this is a pretty standard PHP function. It takes something in, returns something, has some error checking, things like that. So we want to take this and we want to expose it over the API. To do that is very simple. We add these 6 lines of code. So the first line of code adds a callback. And all this is doing is saying, when the API is ready for us to register endpoints, let's start doing it. That makes sure that we don't do it on any pages where we don't have to, and we don't negatively affect performance. The second line here registers the route with the REST API. And so you'll notice there are a few parameters that we're passing in here. The first one of these is the namespace. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second parameter is the route itself. This is a regular expression that matches, a URL that you're accessing. So in this case, we're looking for author/ID, where ID is some sort of integer. And then the third parameter here is the endpoints that we're registering. In this case, we're saying when somebody gets this URL, we want the API to call this function. So with these 6 lines of code, we've now created an API endpoint. And in fact, we can go and try this, and you'll see that it's actually giving us back the title of that post. We haven't changed the function at all. We've added a few lines of code to register it, but already it's working. You can see that I'm using author/1 here, so it's getting the latest post by the admin author. If we try this with an invalid ID instead, such as 999, we'll see that we get the error handling. We get null back. So this is exactly what we wanted to happen. With 6 lines of code, we've changed our function into an API endpoint. And that function is still usable internally. There's no particular special handling inside the function. But that's not really the whole story of this function. Because you'll notice here that although we're getting an invalid author and we're getting null back, we're still getting a 200 OK. This isn't really correct. If you try and access a page on a site that doesn't exist, you'd expect to get back a 404. So we need to change our API to do that as well. So if we have a look at the function again, rather than returning null if there's an error, we can instead return a WPError instance. So this is the normal standard way of returning errors in a WordPress function. There's lots of code in WordPress that expects WP errors, and everything will still work quite nicely with this. We're also passing some extra data with the error, and we're saying that basically we want to override the HTTP status and set that to a 404. If we just return that error without setting the custom status code, we would get back a 500, which is kind of, your standard error sort of code. So this is what we had before. And now, by changing just those couple of lines of code, we now get this back. And this is a much more informative error for clients. Immediately they get a 404, letting them know that we couldn't find whatever data they were requesting. We also get back a bunch of information about what exactly went wrong. We have a machine-readable code, we have an error message that can be displayed to a user, and we repeat the status again. So when we registered this route, I mentioned that the first parameter was the namespace, but I didn't really explain what that was. So you notice here that we're using myplugin/v1. This is essentially like a prefix that you would use on a class or a namespace when you're writing WordPress code. Namespaces are a way of prefixing your API endpoints. And this ensures that you don't have collisions between different plugins and that you're not accidentally overriding part of WordPress core. These are always the first parameter that you pass into register REST route, and they are absolutely required. If you don't pass one of those in, everything will break. So please pass one in. Namespaces can also be used for feature detection by clients, which is an added benefit. This lets clients check if a site has any plugins that they know about, and then add special handling if they do. So you notice here that we're getting the index for the REST API, and the index typically tells us a lot about the site, what's available by the API. Part of that data is that it tells us the namespaces. You'll see here that there are two available, WP/v2, which is the core REST API, the core REST API for WordPress itself, and then there's also myplugin/v1, which is what we registered just before. So going back to our function for a second, one thing you might notice is that we're not actually checking the type of that ID there. This is fine for an internal PHP function where you kind of know what data is getting passed in, and if somebody passes in something random like a string, then it's really their fault for using your function wrong. That's not really the case in the API world though, because people could use this wrong trying to cause security problems or things like that. In this case, we want it to always be an integer. Author ID is always an integer in WordPress. So what we can do is we can go back to our registration code, which looks like this, and add some extra data in that tells the REST API how to handle this ID parameter. So what we're doing here is we're saying no matter what data we get passed in, make sure it gets converted to an integer. There's a function in WordPress called absint, which does the absolute of casting it to an integer, which means that you always get a positive integer out. So this gets us the safe data that we need inside the function, but it doesn't give any errors back to the client. If we were to pass in a string, this would get changed to the integer 1, and internally that might cause another error or something like that. But that's not really what we want for the clients. So instead, what we can use instead of sanitize callback is validate callback. So validate callback checks the value and then returns true or false. For normal IDs, they're going to be numeric. They'll be 1, 2, 86, something like that. And this will return true and everything will be fine and happy. Instead though, if it's false and the value isn't a number, we'll get this error back instead. And so this tells the client that they've passed in some bad data. It has the 400 bad request status code, and it also has some information in the body about what exactly they did wrong here. It tells them exactly the parameter that they screwed up. For more complex use cases, you can actually use both sanitization and validation, if you need to. We can go a bit further with this too. Right now, anybody can go and access this endpoint. But in this example, I want to lock it down to just admins of the site. In normal WordPress, you'd use a current user can check. And so that's exactly what we do here as well. We set a permission callback, and then that also returns true or false. And this restricts the endpoint to only being used by admins or anyone who has manage options. So if I try and access the API now without being logged in, I get this code back. So I get a 403 forbidden, and it tells me I don't have permission to do this, which is pretty great. So there's a lot more that can actually be done with the API. This is just an intro to it. I put the code that I've shown in these slides up on Gist, or Gist, if you're Jafe. And it's all actually functional. You can go and run it, and it will actually do what I said. I'm not faking anything here. You can also go and learn more from the V2 doc site, or Post Status has a great introduction to the API itself. I'm Ryan McCue. I'm a senior engineer at HumanMade. These slides are available online right now, and thank you all for listening. So we have time for some questions, if anybody has any. And you're also welcome to come up and talk to me afterwards, or any time of the weekend, or tweet me, or email me if you have questions any other time.
Good day. Thanks for the talk. It was very insightful. A couple of questions. First is, are there currently any issues with core, so cross-domain requests, if you're available, especially for mobile applications?
So we send cross-origin request headers on every time you try and access, and we allow anybody to access any data from any site. And so the way that we lock it down instead is through authentication. To be able to access it from another site, you don't just need the cookies, which would normally be sent by the browser. You also need to have the nonce set. And you can only get that if you're in WordPress. If you're a plugin or theme, you can generate that easily. Anyone else can't.
But by default, it's actually enabled.
Yes.
For anyone to access.
Yep.
And the second question is, are you planning integration of third-party tools, something like Swagger that automatically documents your REST API for the world to use?
So we actually broadcast JSON schema documentation for every endpoint, and that tells clients what data they can send to create things and stuff like that. The entire API is self-documenting. You can actually load up the index in your browser and click through and access everything in the API just by clicking through. So we support various types of hypermedia. We use HAL, if you're aware of that. Basically, we try and keep it as simple as possible, but we add things where we see there's a need for them. Right now, we haven't seen a huge need for something like Swagger or API Blueprint, which is very heavyweight in comparison. But we are always assessing things and seeing if we can do more for the clients, things like that.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Thanks again, Ryan. I'm sure some of you probably have some questions you want to ask, but maybe after. Ryan is, of course, going to be around for the rest of the afternoon, so please hit him up while he's outside. And we're moving into our lunch break now, so thanks everyone. We'll see you after the break.